The text message glows on Colton's phone screen. It's like a neon sign in our darkened bedroom. Can't wait to see you today. It's been too long. D. My hands shake as I set his phone back on the nightstand, placing it precisely where I found it. Daisy. His ex-wife. The woman he's been meeting every Sunday for the past 3 months, claiming it's just innocent coffee between old friends. The woman who's apparently counting down the hours until she sees my husband again. I slip back under our Egyptian cotton sheets, pretending to be asleep while my mind races. The phone had buzzed at 5:47 a.m. Who sends messages that early unless they're thinking about someone all night? I force my breathing to stay steady as Colton stirs beside me. His hand automatically reaches for his phone like it's a lifeline. The soft glow illuminates his face as he reads the message. I watch through barely opened eyes as a smile spreads across his features. It's the kind of smile I haven't seen directed at anything involving me in months. He types back quickly, his fingers moving with a practiced familiarity across the screen. The response is brief, but his expression suggests it's loaded with a meaning I'm not meant to understand. He turns to me, his smile fading into something more neutral. Morning. Beautiful. His voice carries that forced cheerfulness people use when they're hiding something significant. He leans over to kiss my forehead, and I catch a whiff of the cologne he's already applied. At 6 o'clock in the morning, for Sunday coffee with a friend, I murmur something non-committal and roll over, giving him the space to continue whatever performance he's staging. Through the antique mirror on our dresser, I watch him select his outfit. He chooses with the kind of care usually reserved for job interviews or first dates. The cashmere sweater I bought him for Christmas. The designer jeans that cost more than our monthly utilities. Everything is coordinated to look effortlessly expensive. This is our Sunday routine now, for 3 months. Ever since Daisy Morrison announced her return to Boston via a carefully casual text that Colton shared with me like it was completely innocent. My ex-wife is back in town. Might grab coffee to catch up. Such simple words for something that would systematically dismantle our marriage, one weekend at a time. I remember that first Sunday clearly. Colton had dressed normally then. A faded college sweatshirt, worn in jeans. 5 minutes to get ready. Barely a glance in the mirror. He returned 2 hours later with stories about Daisy's photography career in New York, her struggles readjusting to Boston, how she needed guidance navigating the competitive art world here. I listened while organizing our bookshelf, noting the animation in his voice when he described her projects. The way his eyes lit up discussing her creative vision. Maybe we should have her over for dinner, I'd suggested. Testing the waters. I'd love to meet her properly. The suggestion had landed like a stone in still water. Colton's enthusiasm vanished, replaced by that careful, guarded expression he wore during difficult client negotiations. She's very private right now, going through a difficult transition. Maybe once she's more settled. That should have been my first warning. In 4 years of marriage, Colton had never been protective of anyone's privacy except his own. But I'd wanted to trust him. I trusted the man who'd promised me forever in a church filled with 200 witnesses. Trusted the partner who'd built this beautiful life with me. Brick by expensive brick. Our historic townhouse in Beacon Hill, featured in 3 different design magazines. My thriving partnership at a top marketing firm. His corner office in the financial district overlooking the harbor. We were the couple other people envied at dinner parties. The ones who seemed to have cracked the code on having it all. So, I'd ignored the warning bells. I ignored the way he started caring more about his appearance on Sundays. I ignored the increasing frequency of their meetings, the lengthening duration, the late-night phone calls that sent him walking out to our private garden for privacy. I'd even ignored my own instincts when those calls started happening during our dinner conversations. Colton apologizing while stepping outside to help Daisy with some urgent professional crisis. That always seemed to occur during our limited time together. The shower starts running in our en-suite bathroom, and I know I have exactly 20 minutes before he emerges, fully prepared for another day in his alternate reality. 20 minutes to lie here and pretend I don't know what I know. Pretend I haven't seen the credit card charges from expensive restaurants in the South End. Pretend I haven't noticed how our weekend plans always get cancelled for Daisy's emergencies. Pretend I haven't started sleeping in the guest room, because listening to his late-night conversations with her makes my stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. My phone buzzes on my nightstand. An email from my company's New York office. Marked urgent. The subject line makes my stomach flip. East Coast Division Director, final consideration, time sensitive. I delete it without opening. Just like I did with the previous offers. A chance to head their entire East Coast Division. My own team. Unlimited creative control. A chance to build something entirely my own. But accepting would mean disrupting our perfect Beacon Hill life, abandoning the beautiful existence Colton and I had constructed together. Except our life isn't perfect anymore. Is it? It's a carefully maintained illusion. Like one of those movie sets that looks real from the front, but reveals itself to be nothing but scaffolding and paint when viewed from behind. The water stops running. I hear him humming something while he towels off. Actually humming while preparing for his weekly betrayal. The sound makes my chest tight with a combination of fury and heartbreak that I'm becoming too familiar with. I force myself out of bed and down to our kitchen, needing the ritual of making coffee to ground me in something real. The morning light streams through the large windows, hitting the Italian marble countertops we spent months selecting. Everything in this room speaks of partnership, of shared decisions and combined dreams. The espresso machine we bought on our honeymoon in Tuscany. The handcrafted dining table, where we've hosted dozens of dinner parties. The kitchen island where we've planned vacations, discussed 5-year goals, and imagined the children we'd eventually have. All of it feels like evidence of a crime now. Proof of what I'm losing to a woman who wears vintage band t-shirts and makes artistic poverty look effortlessly chic. Colton appears in the doorway, freshly showered and perfectly groomed. He's wearing that cologne again. The expensive one he claimed was a gift from a client, but which I've never seen him wear for any client meeting. His hair is styled with the kind of careful precision usually reserved for board presentations or photo shoots. Coffee smells amazing, he says, kissing my cheek with lips that taste of the fancy mouthwash he only uses before important meetings. You're up early for a Sunday. I want to ask him about the text. I want to demand an explanation for the morning routine that's become increasingly elaborate. I want to know why his ex-wife is counting down the hours until she sees him. Instead, I hand him his coffee in the mug I bought him last Christmas. The one that says world's best husband in elegant script. The irony isn't lost on either of us. Another crisis with Daisy? I ask, keeping my voice carefully neutral. He nods, already checking his phone again. Gallery politics. You know how complicated the art world can be. I don't. Actually. Neither did he. As far as I knew. Until 3 months ago, when he apparently became an expert in creative industry navigation. But I nod anyway, playing my role in whatever script we're both pretending to follow. He leaves 20 minutes later with a kiss that feels like an apology, and a promise to be back by dinner. I watch from our front bay window as he walks down the cobblestone street to his car, noting the spring in his step that used to be reserved for our date nights. The car disappears around the corner, carrying my husband toward whatever fantasy he's constructed with the woman who used to share his name. I'm still standing at the window when my phone buzzes again. Another email from New York. This time, I don't delete it immediately. Instead, I stare at the subject line and wonder what would happen if I finally said yes to the life that's been waiting for me, while I've been busy trying to save the one that's already over. The New York email sits on my phone, unopened, but impossible to ignore. I pour myself another cup of coffee and settle at our kitchen island, letting the silence of our empty house wrap around me like a blanket I don't want, but desperately need. 2 weeks passed before the first major lie unraveled. It started with the restaurant. I was having lunch with Sarah at our usual spot, a cafe that serves overpriced salads to women who lunch professionally. I needed someone to tell me I was overthinking it, that marriages go through phases, that everything would return to normal once Daisy settled into her Boston life and stopped requiring my husband's constant guidance. Instead, Sarah delivered a lecture about trust and emotional maturity while picking at her quinoa bowl. You're being insecure, she said, stirring her oat milk latte with the kind of confidence people have when they've never experienced real betrayal. It's actually beautiful that they can maintain a friendship. It shows real emotional evolution. Beautiful. That was the word she chose while I described watching my husband transform into someone I didn't recognize every Sunday morning. But don't you think it's a bit much? Every weekend. For hours at a time? Sarah's smile carried that particular condescension reserved for women who think they've figured out the secret to successful relationships. Paige, sweetie, if you can't trust your husband to have coffee with an old friend, maybe the problem isn't him. I left feeling worse than when I arrived. Sarah's words echoing in my head. Maybe I was being insecure. Maybe this is what mature relationships look like. Trusting your partner completely, even when every instinct screams that something is wrong. Tuesday's business meeting with James provided a different perspective entirely. We've been partners for 5 years, building our marketing consultancy from nothing into something respectable. James knows me well enough to read the tension in my shoulders, the distraction in my responses to client updates. Everything all right at home? He asked while we review quarterly projections. I found myself describing Colton's Sunday routine, the increasing frequency of the meetings, the elaborate preparation for these casual coffee dates. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he didn't offer reassurance or patronizing advice. He just raised an eyebrow in that way I've learned to interpret over years of working together. The expression he wears when clients describe marketing strategies that make no logical sense. Interesting, was all he said, but his silence spoke volumes. Later, as we were packing up our laptops, he mentioned it almost casually. Saw Colton last Sunday, actually, at that new place in the South End. Aria, I think it was called. The one with the exposed brick and the $20 cocktails. My hand stilled on my keyboard. The South End. He said they were getting coffee in Cambridge. James's expression grew carefully neutral. Maybe they changed plans. He was with a woman. Brunette. Artistic looking. They seemed, he paused, choosing his words carefully. They looked like they were on a date. The words hit me like a splash of cold water. James quickly changed the subject to client retention rates. But the damage was done. My husband had lied about where he was meeting his ex-wife. And they were at a place expensive enough that James remembered it specifically. That evening, when I casually asked Colton how his coffee with Daisy had been on Sunday, his answer was smooth. Practiced. It was good. Same old place in Harvard Square. She's making some real progress with her gallery contacts. I just nodded. The lie hanging in the air between us. Heavy and suffocating. That was the turning point. The moment my vague suspicion hardened into cold certainty. He wasn't just being a supportive friend. He was being deceptive. And if he was lying about something as simple as a location, what else was he lying about? The question opened a Pandora's box of doubts I could no longer keep closed. My home, once a sanctuary, started to feel like a stage. Every conversation became a performance. Every question I asked felt like an interrogation I had to disguise as casual curiosity. The Sunday after James's revelation, I found myself watching Colton's preparation with a new, clinical detachment. I noticed things I had previously ignored. The way he meticulously cleaned his expensive watch. The extra time he spent choosing the right pair of Italian leather shoes. When he caught me observing his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he offered a sheepish grin. Important networking, he explained, as if styling his hair like a magazine model was standard procedure. For maintaining professional relationships, must be some important network, I said, my voice lighter than I felt. All this preparation for Daisy. His reaction was immediate. His face hardened, his shoulders squaring like he was preparing for a fight. Don't be ridiculous, Paige. Adults can be friends with their exes without it meaning anything. The word ridiculous hit me like a slap. 4 years of marriage. And he'd never called my concerns ridiculous before. Misguided. Maybe. Overthinking. Certainly. But never ridiculous. As if I were some jealous teenager imagining problems that didn't exist. I didn't say it meant anything. I replied carefully. I just noticed you're dressing up more than usual. He softened slightly. But the damage was done. That word hung between us like smoke from a fire we were both pretending not to smell. He left that morning with a kiss that felt more like a formality than an act of affection. And I was left alone in our beautiful house, with the sickening realization that the man I married was becoming a stranger. And the life we built was starting to feel like an elaborate lie. October arrived, bringing with it a crisp New England chill and a new development that made my chest tight with recognition. The phone call started happening at night, usually around 10 o'clock when we were settling in to watch television or read. Colton's phone would buzz on the end table. He'd glance at it, and his entire demeanor would shift. Sorry. It's Daisy. Client emergency. He would step out into our small brick-paved garden, leaving me alone with the muted television and the sound of his animated conversation drifting through the French doors. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was different during these calls, warmer, more engaged than I'd heard him sound in months. The conversation stretched longer each week. 20 minutes became 30, then 45. I found myself timing them. Lying in bed, listening to the rise and fall of his voice while he paced the garden path. He laughed during these calls. Genuine, delighted laughter that made me realize I couldn't remember the last time he laughed like that with me. When he returned to our bedroom, He was always apologetic but vague about the emergencies requiring such lengthy discussions. Gallery politics, client negotiations, industry connections. Daisy apparently needed constant guidance navigating Boston's competitive art scene, and my husband had somehow become an expert in creative industry management, despite never showing interest in art beyond what looked impressive on our walls. What kind of client problems require midnight consultations? I asked one night. After he'd spent an hour outside talking her through some undefined crisis, he slipped back under our covers, his phone finally silent on his nightstand. "You know how creative types are," he said, his voice placating. "Everything's urgent and emotional. She just needs someone who understands the business side of things." Right. Because the woman who built a successful photography career in New York, one of the world's most competitive markets, suddenly needed my husband's guidance on handling basic professional situations. The phone never seemed to sleep anymore. It buzzed during our dinner conversations, interrupting movies we were watching together, lighting up the dark bedroom at all hours with messages from Dee. When I asked about the constant contact, Colton explained that Daisy was struggling with the transition back to Boston, that she needed emotional support, that she required advice on everything from apartment hunting to rebuilding her professional network. "She's very fragile right now," he'd say, as if this explained why his ex-wife required more attention than his actual wife. Fragile. The word started appearing frequently in his descriptions of Daisy. A fragile emotional state, a fragile professional situation, a fragile adjustment to Boston life. This woman who had packed up her entire existence and moved to another country for her career was apparently too delicate to handle basic life challenges without my husband's constant intervention. I started sleeping in our guest room, telling myself it was because his late-night conversations kept me awake. But the truth was more complicated. Lying next to someone while they prioritize another woman's needs over your shared bedtime feels like a special kind of torture I was no longer willing to endure. From the guest room, I could still hear him talking to her through the walls. His voice carried differently at night, softer and more intimate than the professional tone he used during business calls. Sometimes I caught fragments reassurance about her talent, encouragement about her prospects, promises that things would get better. I couldn't remember the last time he spoke to me with that kind of gentle certainty. The guest room became my sanctuary and my prison. 3 weeks into my self-imposed exile from our shared bed, I discovered the dark magic of social media stalking. At 2 a.m, insomnia had become my unwelcome companion. It arrived precisely when Colton's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of someone sleeping peacefully despite systematically destroying his marriage. Tonight, like so many others, I found myself reaching for my phone, my thumb hovering over the Instagram app with the kind of hesitation people reserve for opening medical test results. Daisy Morrison's profile loaded with cruel efficiency. No privacy settings. No barriers between me and the curated glimpse into the life that was consuming my husband's attention. Her feed was exactly what I expected, artfully arranged chaos that screamed authentic bohemian lifestyle. Vintage band t-shirts draped over unmade beds. Gallery openings captured in moody black and white. Coffee cups photographed from angles that suggested deep, artistic contemplation. But it was the locations that made my blood freeze in my veins. The Boston Common Farmers Market, tagged 14 days ago. The same Sunday Colton claimed they were meeting for a quick coffee. The photo showed autumn produce arranged like a still life, but I recognized the vendor stalls, the layout, the historic lampposts that lined the market where Colton and I had shopped together every other weekend for years. I scrolled further, my thumb moving with the mechanical persistence of someone picking at a wound. Our favorite antique shop on Charles Street, photographed 6 days ago with the caption, "Hidden treasures in unexpected places." The image showed vintage jewelry displayed against weathered wood. The same display case where Colton and I found the Art Deco mirror hanging in our hallway. He wasn't just meeting her. He was touring my life with her, documenting places that belonged to us, locations that held our shared memories and inside jokes. Each photo felt like an act of territorial conquest, a systematic claiming of spaces I thought were ours alone. The worst part was how beautiful her photography was. Each image was composed with professional skill, transforming mundane locations into something that looked worthy of gallery walls. She had an eye for finding poetry in places I'd always considered simply functional. Seeing my life through her artistic lens made me feel ordinary by comparison, like I'd been living in black and white while she saw everything in vivid color. Morning brought the monthly ritual of organizing our finances. A task I've always handled because Colton finds numbers tedious, unless they're attached to his quarterly bonuses. I spread the bank statements across our dining room table, cross-referencing receipts with automated charges, looking for the familiar patterns of our predictable life. Instead, I found evidence of someone else's existence threaded through our accounts like foreign DNA. Aria in the South End, $180 for dinner on a Sunday when Colton told me they grabbed sandwiches at a local cafe. Institute of Contemporary Art, admission for two. Purchased the same afternoon he claimed they spent walking through the public garden, discussing her career prospects. And most damning of all, a charge from the Liberty Hotel's lobby bar, dated last Sunday, when he swore they had a quick coffee before he came home early, because Daisy was feeling overwhelmed. The numbers didn't lie, even when everything else did. I photographed each suspicious charge with my phone, building a digital case file I wasn't sure I wanted to prosecute. When Colton appeared in our kitchen that evening, loosening his tie after another day of managing other people's money, I spread the statements in front of him like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Expensive coffee dates, I said, pointing to the Aria charge. His reaction was immediate and smooth. Too smooth? Like he'd been preparing for this conversation. That wasn't coffee. We met some gallery owners Daisy knows from New York. A networking dinner. You know how important connections are in the creative industries. The explanation came so naturally I almost believed him. Almost. Until I pointed to the museum admission charges and watched him construct another elaborate fiction about attending exhibitions to better understand Daisy's artistic influences. To tickets? I asked. She needed moral support. These gallery events can be intimidating when you're trying to rebuild professional relationships, each lie built on the previous one, creating an increasingly complex narrative that explained away every suspicious detail. His voice carried the confidence of someone who has practiced these explanations, refined them until they sound not just plausible, but reasonable. The hotel bar charge required the most creative storytelling. According to Colton, they met a potential client there who was only available for 30 minutes between flights. Daisy had been nervous about the meeting, needed his support navigating the conversation, and afterward, they'd shared a quick drink to debrief. His lies came so smoothly. I started questioning my own interpretation of the evidence. Maybe these charges did have innocent explanations. Maybe I was seeing conspiracies where simple friendship existed. Maybe Sarah had been right about my insecurity poisoning my perspective. Saturday morning laundry became an archaeological expedition. Sorting through our clothes, I realized Colton's favorite leather jacket hadn't appeared in the hamper for 3 weeks. Neither had the navy wool scarf I brought him from Paris last year, the one he claimed made him look sophisticated enough for European business meetings. When I asked about the missing items, he didn't even look up from his newspaper. Dry cleaners. That jacket needs special care. And the scarf got stained at lunch last week. But I checked Beacon Hill Cleaners on Monday afternoon, the place we've used for 5 years. The woman behind the counter knew us by name. Remembered our usual pickups? She shook her head when I described the jacket and scarf. Haven't seen those pieces. Hun. Nothing of your husband's has been in for over a month. I stood in the shop, surrounded by plastic wrap clothes that belonged to other people's lives, realizing that items were disappearing from our home the same way. Pieces of our marriage were vanishing. Small things at first, barely noticeable. Then larger absences that left obvious gaps. Wednesday afternoon found me in our small garden, planting tulip bulbs for spring blooms I was no longer sure I'd be around to see. The physical work felt therapeutic. Digging into the soil, placing bulbs with careful spacing, covering them with earth in the hope that they'll emerge beautiful when the weather turned warm again. Lovely afternoon for gardening. Mrs. Gable's voice carried over the wrought iron fence separating our properties. She was in her 70s and had lived on the street long enough to know everyone's business, without ever meaning to pry. We chatted about bulb varieties and optimal planting depths, until she mentioned seeing Colton last Sunday. Your husband's got good taste in walking routes. The public garden is beautiful this time of year. My hands stilled in the soil. Walking routes? Oh, yes. I was coming back from visiting my sister and saw him near the swan boats. A lovely day for a romantic stroll. The word romantic hit me like a physical blow. He was alone. I asked, my voice tight. Mrs. Gable's expression shifted, her friendly demeanor clouding with the realization that she'd stumbled into dangerous territory. Well, no, dear. He was with a woman. Brunette. Quite pretty in that artistic way. They were walking hand in hand, looking very much like a couple enjoying the afternoon together. She described Daisy with uncomfortable accuracy, the vintage clothing, the camera hanging around her neck, the way she leaned into Colton while they walked. Every detail matched the woman I'd been studying through Instagram photos. The woman my husband claimed required nothing more than friendly coffee and professional guidance. Mrs. Gable, realizing she'd delivered devastating news, quickly changed the subject to her rose bushes and their preparation for winter dormancy. But the damage was done. My neighbor, someone with no agenda beyond pleasant conversation, had provided eyewitness testimony that my husband and his ex-wife were behaving like lovers, not old friends catching up over innocent coffee. I finished planting the tulip bulbs with hands that shook despite the mild afternoon temperature. Dirt accumulated under my fingernails, and I thought about how deep I'd been buried in lies without realizing the soil was covering my head. Each bulb I placed in the ground felt like a prayer for a future that might not include the man I married. The sun set over Beacon Hill, painting the historic brick buildings in a golden light that made everything look beautiful and peaceful. But beauty can be deceptive. I was learning that the most picturesque lies can conceal the ugliest truths. And sometimes, the evidence of betrayal is as simple as your neighbor mentioning, "She saw your husband holding hands with another woman in the park where he once proposed to you." I cleaned the dirt from under my fingernails with mechanical precision. Each scrape of the nail brush echoed Mrs. Gable's words about romantic strolls and hand-holding that had nothing to do with professional coffee meetings. The tulip bulbs lay buried in our front garden, little promises of a spring I was no longer sure I'd be around to see. They were secrets I'd planted in rich soil, waiting for the right season to reveal what I'd known all along. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended state. I went through the motions of our life while building a case against it. Work meetings blended together. Client calls became background noise. I smelled at the appropriate moments during conversations I wasn't really hearing, all while my phone burned with screenshots and evidence I couldn't stop collecting. My grief was transforming into something colder, sharper. It was becoming methodical. I created a folder on my laptop, hidden within layers of client files. I named it simply documentation. Calling it what it really was, evidence of my husband's affair, felt too devastating to acknowledge, even to myself. The folder grew heavier each day, filled with bank statements, Instagram posts, and timelines that laid out Colton's deceptions with brutal clarity. Thursday evening changed everything. I was at my desk, reviewing quarterly projections for a new client, when Daisy's Instagram story notification popped up on my phone. My thumb moved on its own, a reflex honed by weeks of surveillance. The image loaded with devastating clarity. A gallery opening in the south end, all exposed brick walls and industrial lighting. Daisy stood among a crowd of well-dressed art enthusiasts, holding a glass of champagne. She was wearing a simple black dress I'd never seen before, but she had accessorized it with something that made my breath catch in my throat. My grandmother's vintage pearl earrings, the ones with the intricate silver settings that had taken 3 generations to reach me. The earrings Colton had borrowed from my jewelry box last month. He come to me with a story about an important client event, a gala for a potential investor. He'd said he wanted to make the right impression, that the client's wife was a collector of vintage jewelry, and that lending him the earrings to give to a colleague to wear would be a thoughtful, strategic gesture. The lie had been so specific, so detailed, that I had almost believed him. I handed them over, feeling a prickle of unease but telling myself I was being ridiculous. I zoomed in until the screen pixelated, but there was no mistaking them. Those earrings have been in my family since 1952, passed from my grandmother to my mother to me, with stories about wearing them on special occasions, about saving them for moments that mattered. Apparently, a gallery opening with his ex-wife now qualified as a moment that mattered. The timestamp on the story showed it was posted last Thursday at 8:30 p.m. Last Thursday, the night Colton claimed he was working late on year-end budgets. The night I ate dinner alone and went to bed early because he texted that the numbers were taking longer than expected. While I was falling asleep in our guest room, he was watching his ex-wife wear my grandmother's jewelry to an art opening in a neighborhood he'd never taken me to explore. My fingers were shaking, but my actions were precise. I took a screenshot, the click of my phone sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. I added it to the documentation folder. The photo joined the bank statements, the Instagram posts of our special places, and the timeline discrepancies in a digital archive of betrayal that now felt impossibly heavy. By Friday morning, the earrings were back in my jewelry box, nestled in their usual velvet compartment as if they had never left. But touching them felt different now. They felt contaminated by the knowledge of where they'd been, whose skin they had touched, what moments they had witnessed that had nothing to do with our marriage. They were no longer a symbol of my family's history. They were now an artifact of my husband's betrayal. Friday afternoon delivered an unexpected lifeline disguised as a phone call. My boss's voice carried an excitement that cut through the fog of domestic surveillance I'd been living in. Paige, I need you to consider something extraordinary. We're not just talking about a transfer anymore. This is bigger. We want you to launch our entire East Coast division. Based out of New York. Your own team. Unlimited creative control. Complete authority over strategy and implementation. The salary figure he quoted made me sit down. It was nearly double what I was making now. Plus relocation assistance. Plus equity options that could triple my earnings within 2 years. It was the kind of opportunity people build entire careers hoping to encounter. Handed to me precisely when I needed an escape route from the life I'd been so desperately trying to save. I know you've declined before. He continued, his voice earnest. But this role was designed specifically for your skill set. The board is unanimous. They want you. Think about it over the weekend. New York is calling. And they want you specifically. For the first time in months, I found myself actually listening instead of automatically searching for reasons to decline. For the first time, the idea of leaving Boston didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a rescue mission. When Colton came home that evening, he was practically glowing from another successful day of supporting Daisy's emotional well-being. I didn't mention the call from my boss. The silence felt intentional. Powerful. It was my first real secret in a marriage that was supposed to be built on transparency. He moved through our kitchen, preparing dinner while describing Daisy's latest breakthrough in processing her return to Boston. His voice carried the animation of someone genuinely invested in another person's success. The kind of enthusiasm he used to reserve for my professional victories. She's finally found a gallery that understands her vision, he said, dicing vegetables with practiced efficiency. It's a huge step for her. She was so close to giving up. I watched him, a strange sense of detachment washing over me. I saw him not as my husband, but as a character in a play, a man performing a role, completely unaware that his audience now had a copy of the script and knew how it was all going to end. When he asked about my day, his attention felt perfunctory, like he was going through the motions of spousal interest, while his real emotional investment lay elsewhere. It was fine, I said. Productive. And I left it at that. That weekend, the lie about the earrings sat between us. A silent, pulsing thing. I'd watch him check his phone, a small smile playing on his lips, and I'd picture Daisy's face, my grandmother's pearls dangling from her ears. The image was burned into my mind. He was so confident in his deception, so certain of my ignorance, that he didn't notice the change in me. He didn't see that my quietness was no longer sadness, but calculation. My compliance was no longer trust, but strategy. I was no longer the wife trying to hold her marriage together. I was the woman collecting the evidence she would need to dismantle it. October 15th arrived, gray and bitter. The weather matching the significance of the date. It was our 4th wedding anniversary. The day we promised each other forever in front of 200 guests who probably assumed we'd figured out something the rest of them hadn't. I woke up alone in the guest room, having spent another night listening to Colton's muffled phone conversations through the walls. When I came downstairs, there were no flowers on the kitchen counter, no card propped against the coffee maker, no acknowledgement that this date held any meaning beyond being another Sunday. In his carefully structured routine of emotional infidelity, Colton emerged from our bedroom already dressed for another day with Daisy. He was wearing the expensive watch I gave him for our first anniversary, and the cologne that had become synonymous with his betrayal. When I mentioned the date while making coffee, he looked genuinely surprised. Not guilty or apologetic, but confused. Like I'd referenced some obscure holiday he'd never heard of. It's our anniversary, I said, my voice flat, wondering if he would remember without my prompting. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by that particular expression men wear when they realize they've forgotten something significant. Of course, he said, the apology sounding hollow and practiced. I'm so sorry, Paige. I've just been so distracted with work lately. We'll celebrate properly tonight, I promise. Dinner at that place you love in the North End. But the damage was done. He was so invested in his fantasy life with his ex-wife that he had forgotten the actual anniversary of his real marriage. The day we stood before our family and friends, promising to prioritize each other above all else. Don't worry about it, I said. And I meant it more than he could possibly realize. I'm sure Daisy needs you today. He kissed my forehead with lips that felt like an obligation. Before disappearing into his alternate reality, I spent the day alone in our house, surrounded by wedding photos that now looked like evidence of a crime I didn't know was being committed. The albums told a story of two people who believed they'd found something permanent, something worth building a life around. Young faces full of hope and certainty, hands clasped like we'd never let go, eyes that saw futures we were sure we'd share. Looking at those photos now felt like examining artifacts from a civilization that no longer existed. My love for that man, the man in the pictures, was beginning to feel like a memory of a memory. It was being replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when everything you believe in has been systematically burned to the ground. Sunday evening found me dialing James's number, while Colton extended his forgotten anniversary celebration with Daisy into its 7th hour. He texted at 4 p.m. Gallery crisis. Going to be later than I thought. Let's do dinner tomorrow. The casual dismissal of our anniversary dinner, the one he promised only hours earlier, was the final confirmation I needed. It wasn't just forgetfulness anymore. It was a choice. He was actively choosing her over me, even on a day that should have belonged to us. We met at an all-night diner in a part of Boston I rarely visited. The kind of place with fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look tired and honest, and coffee strong enough to fuel difficult conversations. I spread my phone out on the Formica table like a prosecutor presenting evidence in a courtroom. The screenshots of the bank statements, the Instagram posts of Daisy wearing my family's heirlooms, the timeline I'd meticulously constructed, cross-referencing his lies with her social media activity. I even played him a short voice memo I recorded on my phone from the guest room. The sound of Colton's laughter drifting through the walls as he talked to her, a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in months. James examined each piece with the methodical attention he brought to client presentations. He didn't offer platitudes or tell me I was overreacting. He just listened, his expression growing more serious with each slide of my finger across the screen. He occasionally asked clarifying questions about dates or asked me to explain a piece of context I had become too close to see clearly. Mrs. Gable saw them holding hands in the public garden. I said, my voice low and steady. I was past tears now. I was in a place of cold, analytical observation. The same Sunday he claimed they had coffee to discuss her client crisis. James nodded without surprise, as if he'd been expecting this evidence to surface eventually. He tapped the screenshot of Daisy wearing my grandmother's earrings. And this was the same night he was supposedly working late? Year-end budgets. I confirmed, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. When I finished presenting my case, months of documentation that painted an increasingly clear picture of systematic deception. He looked up from my phone with an expression I recognized from our most difficult client meetings. It was a look of grim confirmation, of seeing a problem for exactly what it was, without any of the emotional denial that had clouded my own judgment for so long. You know what this is, don't you, Paige? He said quietly. I nodded, unable to say the word affair out loud. Speaking it would make it real in a way I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. But hearing James, my logical, no-nonsense business partner, confirm my worst fears was a strange kind of validation. It meant I wasn't crazy. I wasn't insecure or ridiculous. My instincts, which I had been told to ignore in the name of trust and emotional maturity, had been right all along. The fluorescent lights of the diner hummed overhead while we sat in the kind of silence that follows a devastating revelation. Outside, the city of Boston continued its life, oblivious to the fact that mine was transforming into something unrecognizable. So, James said, finally breaking the silence, he's not just cheating. He's gaslighting you. He's making you feel like you're the problem for noticing his bad behavior. Gaslighting. The term clicked into place, a perfect label for the subtle psychological manipulation I'd been enduring. Every time he called me ridiculous. Every time he explained away a blatant lie with a more elaborate one. Every time he made me question my own perception of reality, that was what he was doing. He wasn't just having an affair. He was actively trying to convince me it wasn't happening. That I was the one who was flawed for suspecting it. What are you going to do? James asked, his voice gentle but firm. It wasn't a question demanding an immediate answer, but a prompt for me to start thinking beyond the pain and toward a plan. I stared at the phone screen, still displaying Daisy's triumphant gallery photo. I don't know yet, I said. But that wasn't entirely true. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan was already forming. Not a plan for revenge. Exactly. But something that felt like self-preservation disguised as a business strategy. I thought about the email from New York. The one I had saved in a separate folder. The offer of a new life. A clean slate. But I said, looking up at James, I'm done playing defense. It's time to go on the offense. The months between that night in October and the bitter cold of February passed in a strange blur of parallel lives. On the surface, nothing changed. I continued going to work, meeting clients, building campaigns that helped other people sell their dreams while my own decomposed in slow motion. Colton continued his Sunday rituals, his late-night phone calls, his elaborate explanations for charges and disappearances and timeline inconsistencies that now multiplied like cancer cells. We existed in the same house like polite strangers, sharing a physical space and bills and nothing else that mattered. He stopped apologizing for his absences. He stopped offering the elaborate explanations I no longer asked for. Our conversations became brief and transactional. I'll be home late tonight. Okay. I'm meeting Daisy for brunch on Sunday. Have a good time. I'd stopped pretending to believe whatever story he constructed to justify his latest betrayal. And in response, he'd stopped trying to construct them. The silence was a confession in itself. We were living in a cold war of unspoken truths. I let him believe I had accepted the situation. I let him think that my silence was resignation. That I had finally embraced Sarah's advice and become the mature wife who could tolerate her husband's deep friendship with his ex. He seemed relieved by my new compliance. It made his double life easier. He no longer had to juggle his lies. Only his time. He became more confident, more brazen. He started leaving his phone unlocked on the nightstand, assuming I no longer cared enough to look. He was wrong. I looked every night. I documented every text, every call log. I was no longer looking for proof of the affair. I had more than enough of that. I was now studying his methods, his language, the rhythm of his deception. I was conducting opposition research. The New York offer hovered in my inbox like a lifeline I was afraid to grab. 3 times. My boss called for an answer. 3 times. I asked for more time to consider it, telling him I had family matters to sort out. In reality, I was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for Colton to give me the final push, the undeniable permission to leave, by finally being honest about wanting me to go. But he never did. He wanted both. He wanted the stability and comfort of his marriage and the thrill and validation of his affair. He wanted a wife at home and a muse on the weekends. He wanted everything. And in doing so, he valued nothing. February arrived. Gray and bitter. The bare branches of the trees on Beacon Hill scratching at the sky like skeletal fingers. The perfect backdrop for an ending. I was sitting in our kitchen at 7 o'clock a.m. on a Sunday, reviewing a client proposal that felt increasingly meaningless. Outside, Boston looked like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. All blurred edges and muted colors that mirrored the dissolution of everything I once thought was permanent. Footsteps on the stairs announced Colton's arrival. I could tell from the sound that this wasn't his usual casual weekend descent. These steps had a purpose, a precision. It was the cadence of someone preparing for an important performance. He emerged into the kitchen looking like he was headed to a magazine photo shoot, rather than a supportive coffee with a friend in emotional crisis. The cashmere sweater I gave him for Christmas, a charcoal gray Italian, was so expensive that I had hesitated before buying it. The dark designer jeans that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. His hair was styled with products I had never seen him use for any client meeting or social event in our 4 years of marriage. He was a perfect stranger, standing in my kitchen. Another emergency situation with Daisy? I asked without looking up from my laptop. My voice was calm, almost bored. Gallery politics, he said, adjusting his watch with the practiced motion of someone who has performed this routine dozens of times. She's having trouble with a difficult gallery owner who's questioning her artistic vision. She needs someone who understands the business side of creative industries. Right? Because in the span of a few months, my husband, the financial advisor, had become an expert in our world negotiations. I watched him check his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting his collar with the kind of focus usually reserved for a board presentation or a first date. The man looking back at him was someone I barely recognized. Not the person I married, but a carefully constructed persona designed to appeal to someone else's aesthetic preferences. He was Daisy's version of a man, not mine. And in that moment, I realized I was done waiting for him to give me permission to leave. I was going to make him. I closed my laptop with a quiet, Deliberate click. The sound was small, but it cut through the Sunday morning stillness of our kitchen, making Colton turn from his reflection in the mirror. He looked at me, a flicker of irritation in his eyes, as if my simple action was an interruption of his sacred pre-Daisy ritual. "Stay home with me instead," I said. My voice was even, calm, devoid of the pleading tone he had grown accustomed to and learned to dismiss. It was a simple statement, not a question. We could drive out to the Berkshires, like we used to. Find one of those antique markets you said you wanted to visit. His reaction was immediate and visceral, as if I had suggested something genuinely offensive. His face transformed from a mask of casual preparation to one of active irritation. His eyebrows drew together in the specific way they did when a client made an unreasonable demand. "Paige, I can't," he said, his tone sharp. "I told you. She's in the middle of a crisis. I can't just abandon her when she needs my support." The word abandon hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. He delivered it with an emphasis that made its implication crystal clear. Abandonment. Apparently, leaving his ex-wife to her own devices for a single Sunday would constitute cruel, thoughtless desertion of someone in crisis. But leaving his actual wife alone every single weekend for 4 months straight? That was just him being a mature, supportive friend. The hypocrisy of it was so perfect. It was almost beautiful in its awfulness. A cold calm settled over me. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The one I knew I had to orchestrate. What about what I need? The question came out quieter than I intended, but it carried enough weight to make him pause in his preparations. He turned to face me fully, his hand still on the doorknob. For a single, fleeting moment, I thought he might actually consider the question. A flicker of the man I married crossed his face, the man who once would have dropped everything for me. I saw a hint of conflict in his eyes, a brief struggle between the life he had with me and the fantasy he was building with her. I held my breath, watching him. This was his final chance. He could choose us. He could take off the expensive sweater, put on his old college sweatshirt, and stay home. He could decide, right here and now, that his marriage was more important than his ego. But the moment passed. The flicker of conflict was extinguished, replaced by a hard, defensive mask. He chose her. He chose the lie. His face hardened into the expression he used during hostile business negotiations: cold, calculating, designed to end conversations rather than continue them. "We've discussed this exhaustively, Paige," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing, lecturing tone. "Daisy and I are friends. That's all it is. Adults can maintain platonic relationships with their ex-spouses, without it meaning anything inappropriate. It's a sign of emotional maturity." He paused, studying my expression with the analytical precision he brought to financial assessments, trying to gauge if his argument was landing, if I was going to back down like I always did. When I didn't respond, when I just continued to look at him with this unnerving calm, he decided to press his advantage. He thought he had me cornered. He thought he could use my love for him, my desire to keep our marriage intact, as a weapon to finally silence me for good. "Actually," he continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a prepared, final statement, "if you can't trust me to spend every weekend with my ex-wife, then maybe we shouldn't be together at all." The words landed in the silent kitchen, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I could hear the antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, each second marking the end of our marriage with mechanical precision. I could hear the faint sound of Sunday morning traffic starting to build on Charles Street. I could hear the gentle hum of the refrigerator. But mostly, I could hear the sound of the 4 years of my life I had invested in this man. This marriage, finally cracking down the middle, splitting along fault lines that had been developing for months, unseen and unacknowledged until now. He had given me an ultimatum, disguised as a choice: accept his relationship with Daisy, or end our marriage. Trust him blindly, or lose him entirely. Submit to his version of reality, or face the consequences of questioning it. And in that moment, a profound sense of peace washed over me. It was a calm that comes after a long and painful storm, when the wind finally dies down and you can see the sky again. He thought he was trapping me. He thought he was delivering the final, crushing blow that would force me into submission. What he didn't realize was that he was setting me free. He was giving me the out I had been waiting for, the permission slip I had needed to sign for myself but hadn't found the courage to. He had just handed me the perfect, unassailable reason to leave. He had made the end of our marriage his idea. I looked him directly in the eye. For the first time in months, I saw him clearly. Not as my husband, not as the man I loved, but as a stranger standing in my kitchen. A man wearing clothes I bought for him, cologne he saved for another woman, styling his hair for someone who wasn't his wife. This wasn't my husband anymore. This was a performer wearing my husband's face, living in my house, spending my emotional energy while giving his authentic self to someone else entirely. You're absolutely right, I said. My voice was steady, clear, and carried a calm that surprised us both. His face went through a fascinating series of transformations. First, confusion, like a computer processing conflicting information. His script didn't include this response. Then, a flicker of alarm, as he began to realize that his power play had backfired spectacularly. He had expected tears. He had expected accusations, yelling. A dramatic scene he could later describe to Daisy as further evidence of my emotional instability, justifying his need for support from someone who understood him better. What he hadn't expected was agreement. Calm, rational, immediate agreement that his ultimatum made perfect sense. Wait, he stammered, his confident, negotiator stance faltering. That's not what I mean. We should talk about this. We just did, I replied, standing up and picking up my coffee cup. You were very clear about your priorities, and I accept them. I turned and walked to the sink, my movements unhurried. I could feel his eyes on my back, could feel his panic starting to build in the silent room. He stood in the hallway, looking like a man who had just realized he'd overplayed his hand in a game. He thought he completely controlled the ultimatum that was supposed to silence my questions and secure his freedom to do as he pleased had, instead, given me the very key I needed to unlock my own cage. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to his choices. I was about to start making my own. And I knew exactly what my first move would be. Colton stood frozen in the hallway, his carefully styled hair and expensive cologne suddenly looking like costume pieces from a play that had ended abruptly. Mid-performance, the armor of confidence he'd worn while delivering his ultimatum had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked genuinely bewildered about how his strategic power play had backfired so spectacularly. We should talk about this, he said again, his voice now carrying a distinct note of panic that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. He took a step towards me, as if closing the physical distance could somehow reverse the emotional chasm that had just opened between us. We just did, I replied, rinsing my coffee cup with the calm efficiency of someone who has finally stopped fighting against the inevitable. You were very clear. You laid out the terms of our relationship, and I'm telling you, I don't accept those terms. He followed me as I walked past him and up the stairs. His footsteps were quick and uncertain behind me. I could feel him watching as I moved around our bedroom, our former bedroom, collecting the work materials I would need for what was about to become the most important Sunday of my professional life. Paige, wait. I didn't mean we should actually separate, he said, his voice pleading now. I was just trying to explain how important it is for you to trust me. Trust. The word he had weaponized against me for months. The word he had used to make me question my instincts, ignore obvious evidence, and feel guilty for my own pain. Now it sounded hollow and meaningless, like calling rain dry or darkness bright. Oh, but I do trust you, Colton, I said, turning to face him as I pulled my laptop charger from the wall outlet. I trust you completely now. I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, a desperate belief that I was about to capitulate. I let it hang there for a second before extinguishing it. I trust you to prioritize Daisy over everything else in your life, including your marriage. I trust you to lie about where you go and what you do. I trust you to forget our anniversary while remembering every detail of her gallery openings. He opened his mouth to protest, to launch into another one of his elaborate fictions, but I continued before he could find the words. And most importantly, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but each word landing with surgical precision. I trust that you meant exactly what you said downstairs. If I can't accept your relationship with your ex-wife, we shouldn't be together. So, we won't be. I walked past him, leaving him standing in the doorway of our bedroom, and went into my home office. The room had been my sanctuary for months, the one place in the house that felt entirely mine. Now, it was about to become my war room, the command center for executing the most important strategic decision of my life. The email from New York sat in my inbox, a beacon of light I had been afraid to look at directly. I had been afraid of what might lie beyond the familiar, comfortable confines of Beacon Hill, of routine, of a marriage that felt safe even while it was suffocating me. But safety is an illusion when you're drowning slowly. And I have been underwater for so long. I have forgotten what it felt like to breathe. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a moment before muscle memory took over. The words flowed out of me, typed with a speed and certainty that felt like they were coming from a stronger, clearer version of myself I hadn't met in years. Subject: Ray, East Coast Division Director position, acceptance. Dear Mark, thank you for your patience with my decision-making process. After careful consideration, I am thrilled to formally accept the position of East Coast Division Director. I am ready to hit the ground running. When can we discuss transition logistics and a potential start date? I am excited about this incredible opportunity and eager to join the New York team. Best, Paige. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, before the part of my brain that had been trained for years to prioritize other people's comfort over my own advancement could interfere with this moment of perfect, unadulterated clarity. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a physical release of tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Downstairs, I could hear Colton on the phone. His voice was low and urgent. He was probably calling Daisy, describing the domestic crisis he had created, seeking comfort and validation from the woman who was apparently better equipped to understand his emotional needs than his own wife. The conversation lasted for over an hour, his voice carrying that same animated, engaged tone that used to be reserved for discussions about our future. Listening to it now didn't spark jealousy or pain. It sparked nothing. It was just noise. The response from my boss came faster than I expected within 4 hours. Even on a Sunday. Paige, brilliant news. The entire team is thrilled. We were hoping you'd say yes. Can you start in 3 weeks? That would be ideal for the queue to launch. We'll handle all relocation logistics, temporary corporate housing, moving services, the works. Let's schedule a call for tomorrow morning to iron out the details. Welcome to New York. You've earned this. 3 weeks. 21 days. 21 days to dismantle a life I had spent for years building, and reconstruct it in a city where no one knew my history, where I could be someone other than the wife who wasn't enough to keep her husband's attention. Monday morning arrived with the predictable sound of Colton attempting damage control. His footsteps on the stairs were heavier than usual, weighed down by the kind of regret that only surfaces after consequences become visible. He appeared in the kitchen, wearing that particular expression men get when they realize they've not only overplayed their hand, but have also managed to set the entire card table on fire. He looked sheepish but defensive. Sorry, but not really. Like someone who's been caught cheating but wants to argue about the rules of the game, rather than acknowledge their behavior. About yesterday, he began, nervously adjusting his cufflinks. I think we both said things we didn't mean. Heat of the moment. You know, we've been under a lot of stress lately. I looked up from my coffee, genuinely curious about his revisionist interpretation of events. Stress, as if some external force had compelled him to prioritize his ex-wife over our marriage, as if spending every weekend with another woman was something that had happened to him, rather than something he had chosen. Repeatedly. For months. Which part didn't I mean? I asked, my voice carrying the calm interest of someone observing a fascinating psychological experiment. The part where I agreed with your assessment of our relationship? Or the part where I accepted that we shouldn't be together? He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the same gesture he made during difficult client presentations, when the numbers didn't support the narrative he was trying to sell. You know what I meant. Paige, you were being. He stopped himself before finishing that sentence, probably remembering how well calling me ridiculous had worked out for him yesterday. I was being what? Colton. Emotional? Reactive? This whole thing with Daisy has you seeing problems that don't exist. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it almost made me laugh. For months of systematic deception, of forgotten anniversaries, of missing jewelry and financial infidelity, and I was the one creating problems by noticing them. I signed the transfer papers, I said simply, watching his face process the information like a computer running too many programs at once. The kitchen went completely silent, except for the gentle hum of our espresso machine, and the sound of Colton's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. What transfer papers? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. New York. I said. The director position I've been offered 3 times. The one that pays nearly double my current salary. I start in 3 weeks. His coffee cup hit the marble countertop with a sharp crack, sending the dark liquid spilling across the pristine white surface in patterns that looked like abstract art. He stared at me, his face ashen, as if I had just announced my plans to join a mission to Mars or become a professional acrobat, something so completely foreign to his understanding of who I was, of the role I played in his life, that his brain simply couldn't process the information. The compliant wife, the one who had given up promotions to support his life, was gone. And he was only just beginning to understand the consequences. You can't be serious. Colton's voice was a mixture of disbelief and panic. He looked from the spreading puddle of coffee on the counter to my face, searching for a sign that this was just another argument, a bluff he could talk his way out of. He found none. We never discussed this. You can't just make unilateral decisions about our future. The hypocrisy was so perfect, so beautifully crafted, that I almost laughed out loud. The same man who had been making unilateral decisions about our weekends, our finances, and our emotional lives for months was suddenly a staunch advocate for collaborative decision-making. The man who had been conducting a secret, parallel relationship with his ex-wife without ever consulting me about the impact on our marriage, was now lecturing me on the importance of partnership. Actually, I can, I replied, grabbing a paper towel to wipe out the spilled coffee. The simple, domestic act felt symbolic, as if I were cleaning up a mess that wasn't originally mine, but had spilled into my space nonetheless, especially when you've made it abundantly clear that our future isn't really your priority. That's not fair, he protested, his voice rising. You know how important you are to me. Do I? I paused, turning to face him, the damp paper towel still in my hand, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Daisy's career concerns, Daisy's emotional needs, and Daisy's social calendar have been significantly more important than anything involving your actual wife for the last 4 months. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm a little skeptical of your definition of important. He started to protest again, to launch into the familiar script about the innocence of professional friendships and the maturity of maintaining relationships with ex-spouses. But I held up a hand to stop him. I was done listening to the lies. I was done participating in the charade. The house goes on the market this Friday, I added, my voice calm and final. There was no point in drawing out the revelations, in delivering the blows one by one. It was better to amputate cleanly. The blood drained from his face so quickly, I worried he might actually faint. He stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the kitchen island for support. You can't sell our house, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. It's our home. It's where we built our life together. It's my house. I corrected him gently, though the gentleness was more for my own peace of mind than for his comfort. The truth, delivered without malice, was its own kind of power. The mortgage, the deed, the down payment, it's all in my name. I bought it 6 months before we were married. Remember? You helped me choose the furnishings. The financial reality of the situation settled over him like a physical weight. The beautiful Beacon Hill townhouse, the symbol of their shared success, the backdrop for their perfect on-paper life, was mine. Colton earned a good salary for someone his age, but he had grown accustomed to our combined lifestyle. He was used to the kind of comfortable, effortless existence that requires significant professional incomes to maintain without stress or sacrifice. The life he had taken for granted was about to disappear. I can't afford anything comparable on my own, he admitted, his voice small in a way I hadn't heard since his father's business had failed. During our 2nd year of marriage, it was the sound of a man confronting his own vulnerability for the first time in a long time. I know, I said, and I meant it without cruelty. But that's not my problem anymore. The man standing in my kitchen in my house, wearing clothes I had bought for him, suddenly looked like a complete stranger. Not the partner I thought I had built a life with, but someone who had been living in my space, spending my emotional energy, and taking advantage of my investment in our shared future while actively pursuing his own interests, with someone else entirely. 3 weeks suddenly felt like both too much time and not nearly enough to extract myself from 4 years of entangled finances, shared possessions, and the elaborate infrastructure of a marriage that was apparently much more important to me than it had been to him. But for the first time in months, I felt something that resembled excitement, not dread, when I thought about what came next. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in strategic dismantling. I operated with the efficiency of a project manager on a tight deadline. I hired the best realtor in Boston, who had the house professionally staged and photographed within 3 days. The for sale sign went up on Friday, a tasteful, discreet marker of the end of an era. Colton walked past it every morning on his way to work, his face a mask of bewildered resentment. He had moved into the guest roomy former sanctuary and we communicated mostly through terse text messages about logistics. He tried to fight me. Of course. There were tearful late-night pleas, angry accusations that I was being vindictive, desperate promises to change and end things with Daisy. But his promises were as hollow as his apologies. I knew he hadn't ended anything with her. I knew because he was still taking her late-night calls, though he now took them in his car, parked down the street, thinking I wouldn't notice. I knew because the charges for dinners in the South End continued to appear on the credit card statement I was preparing to close. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry he had gotten caught. He was sorry there were consequences. The morning of my departure arrived. Gray and drizzling classic Boston weather that felt appropriate for endings and new beginnings. The movers had already taken most of my boxes. I was sealing the last one, filled with personal files and photo albums I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. When the doorbell rang with the sharp, insistent persistence of someone who has news that cannot wait, James stood on my front step, his laptop tucked under his arm, and an expression on his face that I recognized from our most difficult client meetings. It was the look he wore when he had discovered something significant, something game-changing that no one was going to want to hear. "We need to talk," he said, stepping into the now empty hallway without waiting for an invitation. "Before you leave, there's something you should see." He set his laptop up on a stack of moving boxes in the dining room, the same room where Colton and I used to plan dinner parties and discuss weekend trips we would now never take. His screen loaded with the methodical efficiency of someone who had spent considerable time organizing evidence. I was running some social media analytics for that new gallery client. James began, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. Daisy Morrison's name came up in the data as a trending local artist. So, I did some deeper research, a competitive analysis, you could say. He looked up at me, his expression grim. What I found, it changes everything. The screen filled with screenshots, timestamps, and social media posts, all arranged with the kind of systematic organization that made the marketing professional in me appreciate the thoroughness, even while the woman in me felt her heart sink at the implications. The Sunday brunches, James said, clicking through a series of beautifully composed, artfully filtered images that loaded like evidence in a courtroom presentation. They were in emergency counseling sessions at local cafes. The photos told a different story than any Colton had ever shared. There was Aria, the trendy South End restaurant with the $40 tasting menu. There was the brunch spot at the Envoy Hotel, where celebrities go to be photographed against the backdrop of the harbor. There was Toro, which requires reservations booked months in advance and costs more per meal than most people's weekly grocery budget. These aren't the kind of places you go to help someone through a professional crisis. James stated the obvious. These are deliberate destinations. The kind of restaurants where people go to impress each other, to create memories, to mark occasions that matter. She's been documenting everything, James continued, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering devastating news, as gently as possible. Not just the meals. Look at this. He clicked on another folder. Apartment hunting. The photos made my stomach turn. They weren't just pictures of random properties. They were specific listings in Beacon Hill, on streets within walking distance of my house, in neighborhoods where she could easily and accidentally become part of our daily routine. Places where running into us would feel natural rather than coincidental. It was a strategic infiltration plan, disguised as a desperate search for a new home. But the most devastating evidence, the piece that made the whole sordid affair click into place with sickening clarity, was what James called Daisy's professional portfolio. It was an entire photography series she had posted on her professional website, a series titled New Beginnings. The images loaded, each one a work of art, which made their emotional impact even more brutal. Our favorite pub, the Sevens Ale House, was captured in golden lighting that transformed the familiar, cozy space into something impossibly romantic and intimate. The antique shops on Charles Street, where Colton and I used to browse on lazy Saturday afternoons, now served as a backdrop for artistic compositions that suggested someone documenting their systematic reclamation of lost territory. Even the Boston Public Garden appeared in her portfolio. A shot of the swan boats at dusk, the very spot Mrs. Gable had seen them holding hands. Each image was dated, James said, pointing to the timestamps embedded in the metadata. This isn't casual documentation. Paige, this is someone deliberately creating a visual record of her replacing you. One location, one memory at a time. It wasn't just an affair. It was a project. The photography was undeniably beautiful. Each image was composed with a professional skill that transformed my mundane, cherished locations into something that looked worthy of a gallery wall. But knowing the context made every artistic choice feel like an act of violence. Every carefully framed shot, every artful use of light and shadow, felt like evidence of a calculated invasion. My life, our life together, had been reduced to her source material. It was the subject of her comeback project. She wasn't just having an affair with him, I said, my voice barely a whisper as I scrolled through the images of my favorite places, now tainted forever. She was curating it. She was building a narrative. There's more, James said, his voice getting quieter as he clicked open one final folder, organized by date and location. The timeline. It doesn't just contradict what Colton told you. It suggests something far more deliberate was happening from the very beginning. The timestamps revealed a pattern that made for months of lies suddenly visible in high resolution. Gallery openings they attended together on nights I worked late on client presentations, believing I was supporting our shared financial goals. Weekend trips to Newport, the same romantic getaway I had suggested for us multiple times, which Colton had always dismissed as impractical and too expensive. The evidence spanned months, revealing not just infidelity, but an elaborate campaign of manipulation that made my previous understanding of the situation seem naive by comparison. While Colton was feeding me stories about Daisy's fragility and professional struggles, she was documenting their romance like a victory lap, creating a permanent, artistic record of moments that were supposed to be healing conversations between old friends. She wasn't fragile, I said, the realization dawning with a cold, hard clarity. She was strategic. This wasn't an accidental emotional reconnection. This was a systematic plan to get him back. James nodded, closing his laptop with the finality of someone who has finished presenting a case they wish they never had to make. I'm sorry, Paige. I know this makes everything worse, but you deserved to know the whole truth before you left. He was wrong. Seeing the evidence didn't make everything worse. It made everything clear. For months, I had been questioning my own instincts, wondering if I was the one overreacting to an innocent friendship. I had let Sarah's lectures about trust and maturity convince me that my concerns were a sign of my own personal inadequacy, rather than an accurate reading of a genuine threat. Now I understood. My instincts hadn't just been correct. They had been conservative. The situation was far worse, far more calculated and deliberate than my most paranoid suspicions had ever suggested. I hadn't lost my husband to a moment of weakness. I had lost him to a long con. 2 hours later, I was standing in the departure lounge at Logan Airport, surrounded by the carefully packed remnants of my Boston life. The morning's revelations felt like the final pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving, completing a picture that explained not just what had happened, but why every attempt I had made to fix our marriage had been doomed from the start. You can't repair something when the other person is systematically dismantling it, while pretending to help with the maintenance. My phone buzzed with a text from Colton. What are you doing this weekend? The question carried a payload of assumptions that would have been accurate a week ago. The assumption that I was sitting in some dreary temporary corporate apartment, regretting my hasty decision, reconsidering the dramatic step of leaving our life together. The assumption that the reality of starting over would feel overwhelming, compared to the comfort of our Beacon Hill routine. Even if that routine had become poisonous, he thought he could wait me out. He thought I'd come crawling back. Instead, I looked around the bustling departure lounge, filled with people heading toward new adventures, new possibilities, new versions of themselves they hadn't met yet. And for the first time in months, I felt a genuine surge of excitement, not dread. When I thought about what came next, I turned my phone around, opened the camera, and took a selfie. Behind me, the massive departure board displayed a list of destinations that sounded like freedom: Paris, Amsterdam, Rome, and right at the top of the list, my flight, New York City. My boarding pass was visible in the frame. A genuine smile, not the forced, brittle one I had been wearing for months, spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had just been set free, starting my new life. I typed. I attached the photo and hit send without a second thought. The response came almost immediately. A frantic series of dots as he typed. Wait, you're actually leaving. You're at the airport now? Come home. We can work this out. Paige, please. But I was already walking down the jet bridge. I switched my phone to airplane mode as a flight attendant greeted me with a warm smile. Behind me, Boston shrank to the size of a problem I used to have. Ahead, New York City waited. A city where no one knew my history. Where I could be someone other than the wife who wasn't enough to keep her husband's attention. The plane lifted off, carrying me away from 4 years of carefully constructed lies and toward a future that was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely my own. 6 months into my new life, I received an unexpected message request on LinkedIn. The professional platform felt appropriately neutral, for what turned out to be the most surreal conversation I could have imagined. It was from Daisy Morrison. Her message was carefully worded, devoid of the artistic flair that characterized her social media presence. She wanted to meet. She said she felt she owed me an explanation. Curiosity, more than anything else, made me agree. We met at a nondescript cafe in Soho. Neutral territory, where neither of us had any history or emotional investment. She looked smaller in person than I had imagined. More fragile than the confident bohemian goddess I had constructed in my mind. During months of social media surveillance, the exhaustion in her eyes spoke to the specific kind of weariness that comes from realizing you have been cast as a villain in someone else's story without ever understanding the script. I wanted to apologize, she said without preamble, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup as if it were anchoring her to the conversation. For everything. For believing things that weren't true. For participating in something that hurt you. For not asking the right questions. She paused, staring into her cup. Colton told me your marriage was over in all but name. She continued, her voice small, that you were just going through the motions until it was financially convenient to divorce. That you'd grown apart years ago and were essentially roommates. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. But standing there, looking at this woman who had been my phantom rival for so long, I felt something unexpected, pity, not anger. And you believed him, I stated. It wasn't an accusation. I wanted to, she admitted, with the kind of brutal honesty that only comes after dire consequences make denial impossible. It made everything easier to justify. The restaurant dates, the photography project, the apartment hunting in your neighborhood. If your marriage was already dead, then I wasn't really destroying anything. I was just salvaging the parts I wanted. The conversation lasted for 2 hours. 2 women, sitting across from each other, dissecting the elaborate fiction one man had constructed to serve his own ego, keeping both of us invested in competing versions of the same fantasy. He had played both sides masterfully, painting me as a controlling, suspicious wife to her, while portraying her as a needy, fragile artist to me. We had been his pawns in a game designed to make him feel desired, powerful, and essential. As we prepared to leave, she delivered the perfect postscript to the story. He's completely alone now. You know, she said, gathering her vintage leather jacket with movements that suggested someone who had learned to carry her disappointment with a certain artistic grace. After you left, he tried to make our thing official. But the fantasy was gone. The thrill was in the deceit. In the game. When it became real, it just felt pathetic. The house sold. He's renting some dreary 1-bedroom apartment in a part of the city he used to make fun of. He calls sometimes. I don't pick up. The irony was so perfect. It felt scripted. Colton, who had been so desperate for female attention, that he had maintained relationships with both his wife and his ex-wife simultaneously, now had neither. The man who had needed constant validation from multiple sources to feel interesting had discovered what it was like to be genuinely alone with himself. Walking back to my apartment through the vibrant streets of my new neighborhood, I realized something profound had shifted within me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires an ongoing emotional investment in someone else's choices, and I had finally, fully divested. Instead, I was grateful. Grateful that Colton had been arrogant enough to deliver that ultimatum. Grateful that he had underestimated my willingness to call his bluff. And grateful, in a strange way, that he had freed me from a marriage that was slowly suffocating everything that was authentic and ambitious about who I used to be. Sometimes, people do you the greatest favor of your life by showing you exactly who they are. Colton showed me he was a man who would always choose the thrill of the chase over the comfort of commitment, his ego over his partner, and manipulation over honesty. And in showing me who he really was, he also revealed who I could become, a woman who refuses to accept less than she deserves, a woman who chooses herself when others won't, a woman who finally learned that she can't save a relationship with someone who has already emotionally checked out. Every morning, when I wake up in my own apartment, watching the New York City skyline come alive outside my window. I remember that moment in my Boston kitchen when everything changed. The moment I stopped fighting for someone who wasn't fighting for us, and started fighting for myself instead. I finally chose myself, and it was the best decision I ever made.